So my speech will start 3, 2, 1. Thank you, Chairperson. I would like to deal with two issues in my speech. Firstly, how should we deal with oppression that could happen under autocracy? Secondly, the danger of adherence to identity politics that is likely to happen in decentralized democracy. So firstly, about the oppression and exclusion that opposition is worried about that could happen under autocracy. We'd like to give two rebuttals, two counter-analysis. Number one, autocratic regime have incentive to include minorities' representation to a reasonable extent in order to maintain popularity, and if the insecurity or insurgency very frequently happens, the life of a president or life of leaders are under the threat. So the regime usually have incentive to construct an amicable and peaceful relation with minority groups as much as possible. So let's take a look at the case study of Egypt. When the Morsi was elected as the prime minister, when Morsi was constructing constitution, he was trying to include the representation and voices from Muslim, Christian, and other minority groups as much as possible. Even though Morsi's majority of voters were from Muslim Brotherhood, he didn't overly prioritize interests of Muslim Brotherhood. He was trying to interact with a lot of different religious groups and ethnic groups in order to make constitution inclusive as much as possible. So opposition pointed out the freedom of expression could be marginalized and disenfranchised. That didn't really happen. Many religious institutions, including minority groups, were able to exert their expression and identity in public under the Morsi regime. Therefore, I don't think the unreasonable oppression that opposition is worried about is not likely to happen in autocratic regime in vast majority of cases. Secondly, under decentralized democracy, no thank you, I'll take it later, frequency of warfare will go up. Please imagine the situation. If one group takes the power, all the other groups try to retaliate or revenge and steal the power back, and this is the incentive. That actually happened in Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast, and even Darfur in Sudan. Tutsi and Hutu warfare was the symbol of that kind of phenomenon. And opposition was worried about media's freedom of expression. People have to access media and many information sources, and that could be a very important part of decentralized democracy. But the consequence will be very negative. Many media corporations will sensationalize small incidents and mobilize citizens into warfare and conflicts. Right-wing politicians can use this rhetoric that our group is under the threat, utilizing media to mobilize citizens for civil war. Therefore, this kind of demagogic approach is far more likely to happen under diversity of media in decentralized democracy. Yes, we will sacrifice transparency in autocracy, but we think that's a legitimate and valid trade-off. In exchange for losing transparency and access to media, we have to prioritize longer-term security with less conflicts, with smaller number of people who is killed in the warfare. And this is our priority. No, thank you. Especially when we talk about Egypt, Syria, and Libya, these are the countries with under the strong pressure and hostility against other nations. Surrounding nations may have potentiality of conflicts. Therefore, considering this complexity or geopolitical situation, making stability is the paramount priority, even against other nations' threat. Therefore, losing transparency of media is a fair trade-off, and we are more than happy to accept it. Moving on to the second issues about the nature of decentralized democracy and its danger and propensity to adhere to identity politics. Before moving on, I would like to take point of information from closing opposition, if you have one. Go ahead.
Given that the deep division which is in the motion, where can you say that the things go so inclusive?
Okay. Because as I said before, even if countries are fragmented, the ruling political party or ruling regime has a reasonable incentive to include a representation, because if they willy-nilly commit genocide and ferocity, the regime itself will become unstable under the strong hostility and antipathy against minority groups. The individual members in autocracies' lives will be under the threat, and their bank accounts may be frozen by the economic sanction by other nations. There are multiple levels of pressure not to do so. So moving on to the final issues about the nature of decentralized democracies. So decentralized democracies, the main agenda in election, it will become representation of ethnicity and religion. Usually economic policy, foreign policies, or financial policies are deprioritized or secondary or marginal points in democracy, points in election, and that is dangerous for citizens. For example, what happened in Kenya was the ethnic divide between two ethnic groups was very serious. So Mwai Kibaki versus Raila Odinga, those were the leaders of two different ethnic groups, and they were always talking about identity politics and ethnic politics. They never discussed economic policies and foreign policies or security policies. And voters usually considered ethnic identity rather than any other policy that undermines country stability and economic growth. Compared to this nature of identity politics that happens in decentralized democracy, what happened in autocracy is because regime don't have to worry about identity politics anymore. They can spare resources for economic policy, economic growth, and GDP growth. My partner explained that was what happened in Malaysia under Sukarno regime and Indonesia under Suharto regime. So Sukarno regime and Suharto regime didn't have to worry about ethnic identity because they already had a strong power to govern the nation. They spare resources for economic policy and financial policy. The wages, living standard, GDP of the citizen went up rapidly. Here we have to make a concession. Yes, we concede that discourse among different groups will be reduced. Transparency will be reduced. We concede that, and that will happen. But we are more than happy to prioritize quick and stable economic policy and foreign security policies, because standard for our comparison is the role of sovereign state is to maximize the utility to the largest number of people, and this is a role and paramount priority of the sovereign state. And we would like to hear any counter standard of comparison from other side of the house. So as long as the state can execute the largest utility for its largest number of citizens, we are more than happy to deprioritize and sacrifice the loss of transparency and discourse among diverse different groups. And this is why efficient policy is only possible under strong dictatorship and autocratic regime. We are happy to propose. Thank you.